Everyone here. I know most of you guys, if anyone here is new, I'm Chris O'Donnell, Director of Catechetical Ministry here at San Rafael. I worked for the diocese now for 22 years. I also teach at the Diocesan Institute where men who are undergoing diaconate training, it's kind of their seminary, so to speak. And I'm also currently the minister of the Brothers and Sisters of Penance, the Franciscan organization. And so in order. And so I just want to welcome you all here. I'm looking forward to this. I haven't done James in almost over a decade. I think 11 or 12 years ago I did James. And so it was kind of nice to come back and look over the information again and redo some of it. He was the winner of those of you who voted for which book we were going to look at. And I think it's good because I went back over it and then I taught the class Monday. You know, most of what we know, a lot of you have come to the classes before, and if you haven't, you probably at least have a decent idea of like Paul and his life because we know so much about him. James, you're going to find a radically different person, and so it's a nice view of understanding sort of early Christianity. Before I pass out the handout, though, let's go ahead and begin like we always should by just putting ourselves in the presence of our holy God and just asking for his wisdom and insight. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Father of lights, from whom every good gift comes from above, we ask you, Lord, to continue to give us the gift of faith, hope, and charity. We ask you through the power of your Spirit that we have received in baptism to enlighten our minds with a greater and deeper understanding of you and your mysteries, and through that understanding of your love for us and what you have done for us in your Son Christ, to enliven our hearts with a deeper love for you. We ask all of this in the name of Jesus the Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Okay, so let me go ahead and start to pass these out. And then Sure. So as I mentioned, as the handouts are going around, as I mentioned, in James we find a very different flavor, you could say, than St. Paul. We're going to see a person whose experience, whose understanding of Christianity, like Paul's, is colored in a very unique way because of his background, of who he is. And as we go through James, we really have a nice luxury. James is one of the earliest books we have in the New Testament. It's the third oldest. There's only 2 letters of Paul. Thessalonians 1 and 2 are the only 2 letters older than James. So it reveals to us one of the earliest Christian writings, how the early church lived. As we go through it, we realize James is very, very basic. That is, he's right there at the beginning. James only mentions Jesus by name twice in the letter. He discusses nothing Christologically about Jesus whatsoever, which is such a big idea of Paul. He says nothing about that. The church still meets in synagogues. They do not meet in churches yet. He lives at a time when Jews are still the majority within the Christian community. And so he writes at a very different kind of understanding. Things he's going to highlight, you'll see throughout his letter, and as we look at his life today and what he did and who he was, we're going to see that these come through in all the stories we have about him. He's in the book of Acts, he's in all 4 Gospels, he's got the own letter. Jude, his brother, is one of the other books of the Bible. And so there are kind of 4 things you can sort of see that'll keep repeating throughout this series. James, one of his big things is following Jesus and the Blessed Virgin and the earliest church. James is really strong on the idea of wealth and poverty and where those fit into the Christian life. He writes about it in 2 entire chapters out of his 5. So it takes up a lot of his space because he really sees some issues going on there of how the church is called to live. 2, and really the one that most people, if they know anything about James, the only one they realize is he has a discussion about faith and works. And I'll talk about that a little more in a minute, but it's unfortunate because it's actually only 10 verses of his entire book. And so to focus on that as if that was the focus of the letter of James is to misunderstand James and what he's trying to tell us. But he does speak about the relationship between faith and works. Then you're going to see there are four kind of concepts that keep revolving and interrelating to each other as he's writing. Number one, you understand what we call wisdom, hokmah in Hebrew, wisdom. And in this he connects with the other early Christians, that Jesus is the wisdom of God. Number two, the Torah. When James talks about the law, he means the law, the Torah, that he expects Jewish Christians to still keep 100%. They have not been released from the Torah because of Jesus. So in this he absolutely disagrees with Paul. Number three, you'll see he uses the word perfection 8 times in a short letter. That's because, again, he's very connected to Jesus, who teaches, if you wish to be perfect, this is what you need to do. Those who are perfect, be perfect as your heavenly Father's perfect. This is all very Jesus teaching. Number 4 of that part, purity. He's very concerned with keeping people ritually pure through the laws of the Old Testament, but also morally pure as Christians. And then his final big thing is all of this is done in preparation for the last judgment, the second coming, the restoration of the kingdom of Israel. Now, the letter of James was accepted by the early church. Like all the letters, it went through a process of different churches liked it, others didn't, and as time went on, the letter's accepted, but it's there right from the beginning. And there's really no question about it until the time of Martin Luther in the Reformation. Luther, for the first time in history, takes one particular teaching and he balloons it up to be the entirety of the entire gospel. And that was, he looks at Paul's justification by faith. Luther actually added the term faith alone, which Paul does not say. But now Luther sees everything through the lens of Paul. And so even Jesus, even the Gospels, are to be read through the lens of Paul. And that's how Lutherans today still read the Gospel. So the most important documents in the New Testament are not the Gospels for Lutheran churches and those descended from them. It's Romans and Galatians. Everything's read through those. So because of that, James, of course, has a problem because he teaches you can't have faith alone doesn't save you. In fact, that's the only time the word faith alone occurs anywhere in the Bible, and it's a negative. Faith alone doesn't save you. So Luther immediately set to work to issues with that. I give you a couple of his quotes so you can kind of see it. Right in the middle of page 1, Luther's first statement was simply that James wasn't really that great a book. But at this point in his career, he doesn't reject it. He just says it's really not one of the ones worth reading in the Bible. This is his word. It says, in a word, St. John's Gospel, his first epistle, St. Paul's epistles, especially Romans, Galatians, and Ephesians, and St. Peter's first epistle are the books that show you Christ and teach you all that is necessary and good for you to know. Then skip down where I bolded it. Therefore, St. James' epistle is really an epistle of straw compared to them, for it has nothing of the gospel about it. So in his opinion, he looked at James and said, it's not really that important. Well, because he's challenged immediately by the Catholic Church, who point out James has been read from the beginning, etc., now he gets a little more feisty. Down at the bottom of page 1, about the 3rd line down, you see Luther again. The epistle of James gives us much trouble. That's us Lutherans. For the papists embrace it alone and leave out all the rest. So he claims that Catholics only believe faith and works and nothing else. He says, accordingly, if they will not admit my interpretations, then I shall make rubble also of it. I almost feel like throwing Jimmy into the stove. Right? So he moves, so you can sort of see Luther, he starts from sort of dislike but indifferent kind of, to now getting frustrated because it keeps getting thrown back in his face. This has been scripture from the beginning. Who are you to now decide what is scripture? To the next stage he takes, which I'm not going to read the big quote, but basically on the top of page 2, his next move is that he refuses to allow the gospel or the letter of James to be taught in Wittenberg, where the Protestant ministers are being educated. So it's not part of their understanding. They don't read it. And then finally, his last thing is that, look what he says at that top paragraph, where it says, I maintain. What's his final verdict? I maintain that some Jew wrote it who probably heard about Christian people but never encountered any. Since he heard that Christians placed great weight on faith in Christ, he thought, wait a moment, I'll oppose them and urge works alone. This he did. So his final verdict is, not only is James not indifferent or a struggle, James is a liar, right? He was really a closet Jew who wanted to destroy Christianity from the inside, and I guess the idiot Catholics just accepted it wholeheartedly from the beginning, not realizing that it was really not of Jesus Christ. Okay. So Luther removed James entirely from his Bible. He also removed 2 John, 2 Peter, 3 John. You may know that Luther removed 7 books of the Old Testament, and Protestants kept that. That's why their Old Testaments are shorter than Catholic ones. But he also removed 5 New Testament books, which they're not so proud nowadays about admitting. And it was only a week and a half after his death that his follower, Philip Melanchthon, put them all back in. But what's great is you can go to the Vatican Library today, and we have about 100 copies of the pre-Luther's death Protestant Bibles. They don't have those books. So it's quite clear. I mean, the evidence is absolutely secure. Nowadays, though, really just in the last 50, 60 years, there's been a real consensus among Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants on James, on what he means, and everything else. So that today, most Protestants agree in the main line, at least of what James is saying. They may still overall have a different feel and a different way they kind of live it out. But for the most part, at least among scholars, James has kind of come full circle. In fact, James is one of the most studied writings currently because of the understanding that to really understand the church as best we can, we need to understand its whole background in Israel. Because Jesus makes no sense apart from Israel. And therefore, as one of the earliest documents, a document when there were almost no Gentile Christians yet, he really represents one of the earliest voices of Christianity. St. Augustine refers to James as the second voice of Jesus because he's a man who literally grew up with Jesus. He knew him from birth. And we'll talk about who James was very soon. So you have a lot of things, but the letter is important, but it's caused problems in the history of the church because of the Reformation and a specific view that the Reformation Protestants came to hold that James clearly contradicted. So who is James? We know Paul pretty well. A lot of people at least have ideas about him, even if you haven't attended classes like this or something. The first thing is, there's about 3 names in the Bible. James and Mary are 2 of them, and like every other person is named that at that time period. So these are just the 4 easiest ones. I could have given you about 3 more from the New Testament. Who wrote it? Well, it had to be someone famous enough and considered authoritative enough that the church would accept it. We also roughly know about the time period it was written, so that will help determine if certain people could have been the writer or not. And we come down to sort of 4 people, 4 Jameses. The first choice is we have James, the son of Zebedee, the brother of John the Apostle. Second, we have an apostle himself, so that's James the Apostle. We have another apostle, James, the son of Alphaeus. And he's the brother of another apostle, Levi Matthew. They're both the sons of Alphaeus. You have James, who's referred to as the brother of the Lord. He was not one of the 12, like the other 2, but he is an apostle. And then you have James, the father of Jude, which scholars now identify as the same person as number 2. James, the son of Alphaeus, is also the father of the apostle Jude. So of those 3/4 people, who's the only one that can be a contender? Only number 3, or only James, the brother of the Lord, number 3. James, son of Zebedee, died in 44 AD, much too early to have written this document. James, the son of Alphaeus, who's also the father of Jude, we literally know nothing about. He's never mentioned again in the Bible. Even in later tradition, we have about a footnote of him. So it's unlikely that someone of him would have been the author, because the church would have remembered him better if he had been, just honestly. So the one who the church has always accepted, and modern scholars accepted as well, of the choices, is James, referred to as the brother of the Lord. And so we need to look at who James is. James is a close relative of Jesus. He's mentioned, there's a group of people referred to as the brothers of the Lord, or the brothers of Jesus, 10 times throughout the Bible, the New Testament. They're mentioned 10 times. They're mentioned by name only twice, or 4 times, I should say, because they dual it in different things. And who are these people? Well, that's where we need to kind of understand something. Whenever we come, and this is again why I pointed out why it's important we read these documents and get to know their understanding. Because not by any maliciousness, but simply it's our human nature that we judge and understand things from our own point of view and culture, and we assume everybody else does as well. And so we make horrible mistakes when we try to project modern day understanding back into the 1st century Middle East, which is a wholly different culture, wholly different understanding of everything, of time, family, of all those kind of things. And so we really have to make an understanding. This question, who was James literally? Like, what is his specific family relationship? No one even cared until the 300s. No one even bothered to mention it. And only in the 300s, because by this time the church is no longer at all Jewish. The church has long since left Palestine. Only now, in the Greek world of the Romans, does that matter. Whereas we need to recognize in the time of Jesus, it's too broad a category. We can kind of figure out some stuff who James was, but as you're going to see, it's not as simple as it sounds. Basically though, in the 300s, 3 different opinions came out about who these people were. Adelphoi, who are these brothers, and there are 2 sisters listed as well of Jesus. One option said, well, they're probably, we would call them stepbrothers or half-brothers today. They are related to Jesus through Joseph, through an earlier marriage. And this is today the official view of the Orthodox churches. That's their opinion. One man named Helvidius said they were blood brothers, and he was promptly excommunicated. So you can see that the early church did not accept that option. The only other person to hold it before modern times was another person who became a heretic, Tertullian. And so that's not held, today it's held by most, but not all, most Protestants. Protestants do not in any way, shape, or form accept the perpetual virginity of Mary, which of course would be required. So
Chris, I was having, a mental moment away. Are you saying the Protestants believe that Jesus had blood brothers?
Oh yes, almost every Protestant church except for maybe a couple. Now the original founders, for instance Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, they all believed that Jesus did not have blood siblings. But as time went on, more and more Protestants began to accept this view. Because on the surface, at least in translations, it seems like the most common sense interpretation. But that's what we're going to see. It's not as easy as we can understand. Yeah?
The term blood brother, then...
Same mother, same father.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And
it's
Chris,
always been that way, even in 300 AD?
Yeah,
Okay.
well, that's the different, yeah, that's the, well, this is the different interpretations that come up. We're gonna see what scripture actually tells us, that we learn a lot more.
is the shrine in Spain where you walk the way this St. James?
That's, no,
It's not.
no, that's the one died in 44 AD, the
Thank
brother
you.
of, the
Okay.
brother of John,
I
the
didn't
beloved.
know that.
The last one was either cousin or other close relative. That's St. Jerome's opinion. And this is the Catholic approach. If you look in your handout, let's see, on page 3, near the top you have an indented paragraph. And we'll dive into this in more detail, just because it's sort of laying it out here. The church has always understood these passages as not referring to other children of the Virgin Mary. In fact, James and Joseph, brothers of Jesus, are the sons of another Mary, a disciple of Christ, whom St. Matthew significantly calls the other Mary. They are close relations of Jesus according to the Old Testament expression. So notice what the Catholic Church says. We simply say that they're not his blood brothers. We leave open entirely whether this could be true, whether they're cousins, whether they're something else. We simply say what they can't be. They cannot be this. Basically, anything else you can believe as a Catholic. However, in modern times, very modern, in the last 50 years, there's become a consensus. When I do my research, I told you guys before, I usually have like 40 to 50 books, things like that. And obviously a lot of those are Protestant books as well and such. There's not all Catholic authors. And even among the Protestant scholarship, a lot of people accept these kind of things now because the more we read scripture, the more we understand it, the more clear some of these issues become. So let me sort of begin to lay this out. In the Bible, the Old Testament is written in what language, primarily? Anyone?
Hebrew, Greek.
Hebrew.
Hebrew.
With a little bit of Aramaic at the very end, but not enough to really count much. So we have Hebrew, the sacred language. Now, in the late 500s, I think it's 538 BC, but don't quote me. Somewhere around there, though. This is when the country of Judah is destroyed. The priesthood the temple is destroyed, so the priesthood has no function. The kingship is ended, although the descendants of the kings and sons of David will continue. Jesus physically is one of them. They'd never rule a country again of their own. And within 100 years, the prophets no longer speak. And this is called the Babylonian captivity. And the reason it's called captivity is because the Babylonians exported thousands of Jews throughout their empire. The Babylonians were actually very smart. As they conquered a territory, they would take about half the population and spread it among their other areas. That way you mixed people who did not speak the same language, did not have the same culture, maybe didn't even like each other historically, and in that way you're almost guaranteed they couldn't get enough unity to form a revolt. So that's what they did, and Israel was no different. So Israel was spread throughout that whole Mediterranean world. Well, by the time of Jesus and much earlier, that means more Jews lived outside of Palestine than inside of it, as is true today. There's more Jews in New York City than there is in this country of Israel today. So this has been a phenomenon. Well, the Jews living outside of Palestine do not speak Hebrew anymore. They speak Greek. And so a translation is made of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, which we call the Septuagint, because it took 70 years, septa meaning 70, to translate. And that book becomes sort of the Greek Bible, or the Hebrew Bible of the Greek-speaking Jewish people. And that's the first time that we see the word adelphoi, a Greek word, brought into it. So how did the people who were themselves knew both Hebrew and Greek, how did they use this word, which is translated brothers in the New Testament, how did they use that term to translate terms in the original Hebrew? What did it stand for? Well, it's a laundry list. It can mean an apostle or disciple of Christ. Go tell Peter and the brothers that I am coming. It could be a neighbor. If your brother has anything against you at the altar, leave your gift, go back, be reconciled with your brother. It means an adopted brother, referred to. It's a member of one's religion and ethnicity. I wish I could be accursed, Paul says, for the sake of my brothers. He means the Jews who don't believe in Jesus. It can be a relative. So for example, let me add one little other twist. Unlike Greek, Hebrew, a very tribal culture, Hebrew only has a few words for family relationships. It has father and mother. It has husband, wife. It has son, daughter. There's no generic word for child in ancient Hebrew. Nobody's just a kid or a child. You're a son or a daughter. And then you have brother and sister. That's it. That's all of them. So for example, it can be confusing if you're trying to read literally like we tend to without this idea. For example, in Genesis, Abraham, he had a younger brother who passed away. His younger brother had a son named Lot. So today, in our culture, and this would have been true in Greek culture, Lot would have been Abraham's what? Nephew. But he's never called that. There's no word for it in the Old Testament. And because they wanted to be as faithful to the translation as they could, the Hebrew translators translated Adelphoi. He's Abraham's brother. The same thing happens with Jacob and his uncle Laban, his mother's brother. He's referred to as Laban's brother, even though he's really a nephew. You have, you see this over and over again, this naming of people. It can be just a kinsman. It can even be a slave. When Rachel is found by Abraham's slave, servant, he even refers to himself as your brother. Why? Because he's a servant. He's part of the family of Abraham, her kinsman. So the thing we need to recognize is they don't think and make distinctions the way we do in this familial tribal culture. So because of that, when the New Testament comes out of Greek, it's using the same type of writing that the ancient authors did for this. Other things that it means: a close friend, a political ally. It can mean a blood brother, a half brother, a step brother, an adopted brother. And all of these are found in the Old Testament. So the first thing to realize is the term isn't as clear as it may seem on the surface reading an English translation. And we go, oh, it's obvious. Brothers of Jesus, we know what that means. No, as we go through, we notice that there are 4 people given names of Jesus, brothers. And they do always appear with Mary. So let's just kind of start to chart this a little. So we have this woman, we have Mary. This is the Blessed Virgin Mary. And we have at least 2 sisters, because it says his sisters. They're never named or mentioned again, but we know that there are at least 2. And then he has 4 people who are referred to as his brothers. James is always listed first. The second one is named either Joseph or Joseph. They're the same name, just one's Greek, one's more Hebrew. Then we have Judas and Simon. These 2 are only mentioned a few times. But you have these 4 names that come up. Now, the problem is everything's relative, and I mean family relative in this community. These people are named. Sometimes they're with the Virgin Mary. Sometimes they're by themselves. Sometimes they're part of a larger group that we just translate as relatives. So who are they? Well, the real clincher comes down at the end. And I actually gave you guys this kind of chart. When we get to Jesus' crucifixion, it's on page 4 near the bottom. 3 of the Gospels record who's present when Jesus is crucified. Luke does not. He just says those who were with him stood at a distance. He doesn't identify anyone by name. So we have Mark, we have Matthew, and we have John who identify who is there. Now, because John, writing much later, almost 30 years later, John is the only one to include the Blessed Virgin and himself. He's telling us that. So we can already remove them from the chart for a little bit. What we're left with, however, is this, what we call in scripture studies a triple tradition. In other words, if you find the same sort of thing at least 2 or 3, if not more times, then the tradition itself must be very old. It goes back to the beginning. So here we have, look at Mark, who we believe is the oldest gospel writer in its current form. He tells us 3 women are there. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, that's 2 of the people named as Jesus' brothers, and Salome. Okay? Matthew, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and this is why we know that the woman here and these 2 children are the same people that were talked about before the crucifixion, because every time they're named, Matthew corrects the name from Joseph to Joseph. You wouldn't do that every single time unless you're referring to the same people. It doesn't make any sense. So it's clear that the people here, the James and Joseph here, are the same 2 that are named his brother during his ministry. And then number 3 says the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Okay. Now why does he say that? Easy. Mark, when Mark writes, Mark is writing about people who are known to his community. For example, Mark is the only one who tells us, when he gives us the story of Simon of Cyrene helping Jesus carry the cross, he tells us one little bit of information no one else has. He says, Simon, you know, the father of Rufus and Justin. Now why does he say that? Because Rufus and Justin are sitting in his church. He knows them. The people there know them. Remember, Gospels were not written for the world. They were written for a church, a single community. He knows these people. He knows Salome by name. By the time of Matthew's writing, Matthew's audience won't know who she is. But they will know who she is if they tell her she's the mother of the sons of Zebedee. She's John and James's mother. Okay. And then you finally have John. He has Mary Magdalene. He has the second woman named Mary, which is in line with the others, but he gives us some more information. And then we have his mother's sister. That's his, Jesus' mother's sister. And then you have Jesus' mother and the beloved disciple. Now, John does the same thing that Matthew does. Notice Mary Magdalene's across the board. She is so famous, no one has to mention her except by name. The early church knows her. There's no reason not to. 2, the second woman is also well known. She's also a famous Mary. But she's famous because of her children, not because of herself, but it still makes her. But he gives us the last piece of the puzzle. Mary, who's the mother of Joseph the younger and James, is also the wife of Clopas. So it actually becomes really simple now. We have Mary, who is not this Mary. Mary and Clopas have 6 kids, 4 sons, of whom one is James, and 2 daughters. And they are in some way related to Jesus, but we don't know how explicitly yet. And like I said, even Protestant scholars agree with this because they look at the picture and they say, it would be the weirdest thing ever, especially for Matthew, who's talked about the virgin birth and everything else, that when he gets to the story of the crucifixion, he'd refer to the Blessed Virgin as the mother of James and Joseph, but not Jesus. That's just weird, right? You're like almost trying to hide that she's Jesus' mother in that sense. And same with Mark. It doesn't make any sense. And then with John's evidence that Jesus' mother is there, it becomes clear that this is a different Mary. Still part of the family group. Remember, we have to break out of our model of like little nuclear families and stuff. This is part of the family group that Jesus belongs to. We can't say anything more beyond that of his relationship. But we can destroy some of the options from the early church. Number one, he is not a blood brother, nor is he a half-brother. So the Orthodox view, who don't like this, it has been pretty much destroyed. Now, one option open to Catholics is kind of destroyed by this as well. He is not a cousin. Why? Because the word cousin is used in the New Testament, like Paul says, my cousin, and there's a Greek word for that, anepsios. So if they wanted to say that he was Jesus' cousin, they'd call him a cousin. So he's a relative of Jesus. Beyond that, we don't know, except that he cannot be a cousin, half-brother, step-brother, blood brother. He is something else. Whoever he is, he's the most important because he's always named first. That means you're the important. That's the status of the ancient world. That's why Peter is always named first in the list of the apostles. So he's this important, but beyond saying that he's a blood relative of Jesus, we can't say anything more. But we can definitively rule out that he is not a child of either Mary, the Blessed Virgin, or of Joseph. We know who his parents are, both of them. Okay. Now, just to play a little more game, because you kind of see how this works out. This one's not as important for James, but look at number 3. We have Salome, who is the mother of the sons of Zebedee. So Zebedee's wife's name is Salome. And who is she? She's Mary's sister. They are his cousins,
Really?
James and John.
She had a sister?
And that makes perfect sense for several things. Remember, this is how you sort of look through Scripture and you find these things.
How many children had St. Anne?
Right, well here's the thing. How is Mary, what tribe was Mary from? No.
David.
Mary is said to be by Paul from Judah, just like Joseph. But that's the point. How does she have a cousin who's a Levite? Elizabeth. Elizabeth is a Levite because it says she's of the Levite tribe, not just married to a Levite man, which is almost unheard of. Be married within the tribe because that's the priestly tribe. So how does she have a Levite cousin? We don't know exactly, but it makes a lot of sense now that we see that side of Mary's family, and this is her side of the family, not Joseph's. Because it makes sense first that they're related. That's why Salome asked Jesus, when you come into power, my boys should sit on right or left. Why? Because they're the closest living relatives you have. They're even closer than the brothers of the Lord. Remember, in one instance, it's her. In the other version, it's the boys themselves. But either way, they're calling on a family thing, right? If you're the king, Lord, like all Oriental kingdoms, we're your family, we should be in charge. The second thing is this. Mary's sister has married into the Levitical tribe. She has to. It's almost guaranteed that John and James, this other James, are Levites. You say, well, they're fishermen. Yeah, you need to recognize something. Unless you were a member of the high priest or the chief priests, which had to be directly descended from Aaron's 3 sons, unless you were one of those small group, you only served in the temple 3 months out of the year. You were divided into sections. If you remember the beginning, you may go back and look at the beginning of Luke's gospel, and Zechariah, we're told it's his turn. That means that's his 3 months. Well, what do you do the other 9 months? You got to support yourself. So you have occupations. Most of them are butchers or fishermen because they're used to killing animals. That's what you do as a priest. But let's look at more detail. when Jesus is arrested, we are told that John knows the high priest personally enough to get into his own courtyard.
Oh.
That's where he and Peter go. Now, if you're just a fisherman, I guarantee you don't know the high priest personally. Why does John know him? Because he's a priest. Third, John writes the book of Revelation. He describes the interior of the temple, which no Jew except a priest would have ever seen. How does he know what's there? How does he know what it looks like? Well, you could say it's all a vision, but the simpler explanation is he's seen it. He knows what it looks like. So it's funny, when we actually look at Jesus's, I want to show you a little chart of the disciples and the earlier followers of Jesus. And you get a really interesting understanding that this is a whole close-knit family affair, so to speak. Look, we have one James, and his brother is Matthew, also called Levi. How do we know they're brothers? Because they are both the sons of Alphaeus. This James, so there's two of the 12. This James is the father of one of the other apostles, Jude Thaddeus. That's three of them. So they're all interrelated, even though it's not clear they're related to Jesus. But here, 1/4 of the 12 is already one family unit within itself. Well, then you do another set of brothers, Simon Peter and Andrew. Then you do another set of brothers who also turn out to be Jesus' cousins.
James and John. That would be why Jesus gave bless another to John. It's his aunt.
Yes. So 5 and 6. And then connected to them somehow, of course, is also going to be Elizabeth and John the Baptist, who are also, who's Mary's. Now, this is a bit bad translation that's got us into problems. The word used here is not cousin for Elizabeth, although we say she's his cousin. Some translations even say that. That's not the right word. The modern translation says relative. Because the word anepsios, which is used for cousin elsewhere, is not used of her. The word is relative. It's just a generic member of Mary's larger group family. So you have that. And then you kind of have the ones that are off to the side, who aren't really connected. You have the other Simon, the Zealot. You have Bartholomew and Philip are close friends. They're never listed apart from each other, so some have thought maybe they're siblings too, but we don't know. Okay, I was right the first time. And then, and Philip. And then, of course, you have Thomas. And what's interesting is Thomas is always called a twin. That would assume that he must be a twin of probably one of the apostles, but we're never told which one.
Oh.
So one of these
This is his twin.
maybe is his twin, or even maybe one of them. But unlikely, probably not this one or these because they're named as the same parents. But maybe one of the others. And then of course you have Judas Iscariot. But then you add to that, and then like I said, you've got Elizabeth and John, and now you have the brothers of Jesus, at least 2 of whom became followers, because we have their letters in the Bible, James and Jude, and you've got them too. I mean, it's interesting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7, over half the disciples are interrelated or close friends in some way out of the 12 right off the bat. So the connection between Jesus and who's with him there is a really important one. What's interesting, we have a later story, and it's a really interesting story that just kind of adds a little bit more to this. In the year about 105, the Roman Emperor Trajan, who took office in 98 AD, and about 10 years into his reign, the Roman officer Trajan is hearing about these Christians. Remember, this is 200 plus years before Constantine makes the church legal. He's hearing about these Christians and that they follow another king, Jesus. So what does he do? And it's a really interesting story. It's found in ecclesiastical history by a man named Eusebius. He was writing in the 300s. And he brings forth he has all these evidences he points out. Well, what happens is, to make sure there's no threat to his rule, he discovers that the grandson of the brother of the Lord Jude are called bishops in Jerusalem. So round these people up, I want to see who my competitors are. We're told all these grandsons of Jude, which would be, blood relatives of Jesus, through whoever those brothers are brought before Trajan. When he sees them, he laughs and sends them back. He goes, oh, those guys, they're never going to mount a revolt. Right? He's thinking in secular terms. They follow a king. They're descended from a king, a kingly family. Then he looks at it and goes, oh, they're just poor people. They're not going to do anything. But the story's interesting because it tells us that Jesus' relatives ruled over Jerusalem until at least the early 100s. They were still alive. So it was family transfer, because James is the first Jerusalem bishop. And then his brothers, his great nephews, are alive in the time of Trajan. So we have this whole sort of family dynamic that's kind of happening as in the early life of Jesus. Now let's look at James. We know he's a relative of Jesus. At the bottom of page 5, I point out, initially he did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and especially not divine. In fact, we're explicitly told by John, his brothers did not believe in him. Right there, John 7:5. They didn't buy who he was. We have an even more strict story that's found in Mark. And if you will, go to Mark's Gospel, chapter 3. Here's what happens at this event. Chapter 3 of Mark, we have verse 20. Jesus has just chosen the 12. He's just made the apostles. Now, one of Mark's structures, his narrative techniques, is he likes to contrast Jesus' spiritual family, the apostles who believe in him, with his earthly kinspeople, the Jews, and his even immediate family who don't, showing that the more important is the brotherhood under God, not family bonds. So we have this story. Jesus, came home again. Again, the crowd gathered, making it impossible for them to even eat. So he gets home and everyone's been waiting. They're like the miracle workers back, so they're all jamming the door. When his relatives heard of this, they set out to seize him, for they said, he's out of his mind. They set it up for the scribes and Pharisees to say he's possessed. See, even his own family doesn't buy it. He's not the Messiah. He's a crazy lunatic. Right? If anything, he's possessed by a demon. That's why he can do magical powers. So clearly, the brothers were not believers in him. Now, we don't know, unlike Paul, whose whole conversion we pretty much know, we do not know what happens between Jesus' ministry here, and this is early on in the ministry. We don't know what happens to James between the ministry and the resurrection of Jesus and Pentecost. After chapter 6 of Mark and the corresponding connected chapters in Matthew and Luke and John, the brothers of Jesus are never mentioned again until suddenly James is present at Pentecost. If you go to Acts chapter 1 now, look at Acts. Actually, go to Acts. It's actually going to be Acts chapter. Let's see. It is Acts chapter 1, verse 13. After Jesus ascends to heaven, when they entered the city, they went to the upper room where they were staying. That's the upper room of where they had the Last Supper. Now, to make it more confusing, another Mary owns this house. She's the mother of John Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark. The naked guy who runs away when he sees Jesus captured. So they're in the same place the Last Supper happened. And we're told who's there. Peter, John, James, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Bartholomew, and Matthew, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, Judas, the son of James. All these devoted themselves with one accord to prayer, together with some women, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. So all of a sudden, he's there. And so he's at Pentecost to receive the Spirit. Well, Paul gives us another tidbit we didn't know. Go to 1 Corinthians, chapter 15. Now, I always try to remind people, remember that every single letter of Paul was written before the first gospel was ever written. Paul is the earliest evidence we have of Christianity. In 1 Corinthians in chapter 11, he gave us the earliest evidence of the Lord's Supper in the words of institution, long before a gospel is written. So he's sort of this, he's a good person to see. Here he's going to give us the evidence of the gospel. So in chapter 15, verse 3, he says, "For I handed on to you as of first importance what I also received." Now this points something out to us as Catholics. In English, the word handed on and received are the same word in Greek. In Greek, the word is paradosis. When you translate paradosis directly into Latin, to hand on is traditio. That's where we get the word tradition. Paul is saying, remember, Paul wasn't one of the 12. He wasn't there when Jesus rose and ascended. He's later. He's telling them, at this early stage, there's already tradition. He says, I'm handing on to you what I got, and I'll add my little part to the end. Well, what did he get? That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas. Who's Cephas? Peter. Cephas. Then he appears to the 12, right? The 12 apostles. Then he appears to 500 other disciples. Notice 500 brothers, just to show you that confusing term everywhere, adelphoi. And he says something interesting. He says, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Now, why does he say that? It's apologetic. Remember, Paul's saying, if you don't believe my story, go ask them. Ask what they saw. Ask that they touched him. Ask what happened. Then he says, he breaks that, and then he says, after that, he appeared to James. Then he appears to all the apostles. Notice, and then he appeared to Paul. Paul sets up kind of this structure, though. You sort of have the original, most important group. Peter's number one. He's the center fold. Then the 12. Then these other 500 who had known Jesus. Then it's kind of like the second core comes in. Then you have James, who's the most important. Notice 12 and apostles are kind of connected, which means James and Peter are kind of connected, and we'll see this later. All of the 12 are apostles. Not all apostles are the 12. Now what's the difference? Because Paul's an apostle. James is an apostle. James is called an apostle by Paul. What is an apostle? To be an apostle meant, I'll put three sort of things down. If you were commissioned to preach, that made you a missionary. Who did that? The church. They send you out and you become a missionary, like today. If you're commissioned to preach by the resurrected Christ, that means not by the church, but Jesus himself appeared and said, you. That makes you an apostle. If you were commissioned to preach by Jesus, saw the resurrected Lord, and you had known him since the time of his baptism, during his earthly life, and you had been chosen out of all those by him, that made you one of the 12. That's why the very first thing they do in the book of Acts before Pentecost, they have to replace Judas. And these are the criteria. The person has to have been here since the baptism of John. Now notice that's odd because that gives us something, not to get too speculative, but that gives us an interesting sort of dilemma. That means that all the 12 knew Jesus before he was baptized. They would have to, because he doesn't have any followers yet. So it's not till after his baptism he goes out and he calls James and John, he calls the others. But it also adds credence to the fact that that whole group of 12 already knew each other before he ever chose them out of the larger group of them. But that's the difference. So Paul and James Paul's an apostle, and James are apostles because they saw the resurrected Lord and they were called to be one of his followers. They weren't part of the 12 though, because neither one was ever chosen by Jesus, and Paul certainly didn't know him from the time of the baptism. And so that's what differentiates the two. But so now we're told James did see him resurrected, and James is there at Pentecost. So exactly at what point he was converted or what happened, we have no idea. Some people say it was this that did it. And that's why he's in the side with Paul. Because Paul also didn't believe before he saw Jesus. Maybe at that point we're only guessing. All we can say with certainty is in the beginning he did not believe Jesus was the Messiah. But he then becomes one of the major players in the church. So we don't know any of the fill-in between of what's going on, but we do know that he's related to Jesus. He becomes an apostle. He sees the risen Lord, and he ends up becoming the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And really quick, it's almost our break. Let's just lay out some of the things that show how important he was. I call James the forgotten member of the Trinity among the apostles, because in the God, Father, Holy Spirit, most of us, the Holy Spirit's kind of the third member, right? He's just kind of out there. It's mostly the Father or Jesus. In the same way, we always think of Peter, especially as Catholics. We love St. Paul because he wrote 13 letters. And James we don't reflect on, not realizing that James, not Paul, is the reason that you and I are all sitting in this room are Christian. It's James who decides the rules for a Gentile to become Christian without becoming Jewish, not Paul. And we'll look at the story soon. So he's very important. In fact, he's the closest in the New Testament, of all the letters. St. Paul almost never quotes anything Jesus said. Because he wasn't there. It makes sense, right? He didn't know Jesus' teachings. He has to learn them from others. Although James never quotes word for word, there are 30 different allusions or quotations, if you will, of the Sermon on the Mount in 5 little chapters. Everything James says is from his, quote, relative Jesus. So he represents the real, that's why Augustine said he's the second voice of Jesus, because he simply repeats Jesus' teaching directly as they are for his community on how they need to live. So who was this guy? He obviously had a lot of power. Well, Paul tells us he's an apostle. Paul refers to him as the brother of the Lord. So he has this significance in the early church. And then here's other things. You see some of the titles he's given. He's called person of repute, a pillar of the church, one of the important. Every time he seems to have been a leader that the Jerusalem church was ruled by a trinity. Peter, James, and John. Those are the leaders. When Paul goes to Jerusalem, Paul goes to Jerusalem 3 times in his life as a Christian. Each time he meets only James or James and Peter. So James is always there. So James clearly has some huge authority in the church. It is James who writes the apostolic letter that tells us what we Gentiles have to do to become Christian. So James is the one who sets that in motion and writes the letter on his authority. Later, just his influence causes Peter to change his behavior. We'll look at that story. Peter goes to Antioch where Paul is, And at Antioch, the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians were eating together, because the letter hadn't actually settled that. It didn't have anything to do with how the groups relate to each other in the church. It just had to do with how does someone come into the church in the first place. And we're told up till that point, Paul is furious because up to that point, Peter used to eat freely with the Gentiles. And we're told when men from James showed up, he stopped. Right? So the threat of James knowing Peter wasn't doing what he was supposed to was enough to get the leader of the church to step aside. When Paul goes back to Jerusalem the last time, where he's finally arrested and brought to Rome to die, but his last trip when he arrives there, Peter's long gone, he's not in Jerusalem. James accepts the collection that Paul gives him from the Gentile churches, but then as a show of obedience, he makes Paul take a Nazirite vow. So Paul has to shave his head and do it, and Paul does it without question, Book of Acts. So this was a man who had huge power in the early church, and we need to recognize that to really understand who he is. So let's go ahead, we're at our break. Let's go ahead and take our break and come back and look at some of these stories of what he did for us as Christians.
So it sounds like Chris said